Hello, everyone, and a very good morning to all our friends in the US, and a very good evening to all our friends in India. My name is Karthik, and I'm a first year MBA student at Columbia Business School and a part of SABA. I wanted to welcome you all to day two of the India Business Conference. For those of you who were not able to join us yesterday, let me start with a quick background on the India Business Conference and who we are. The India Business Conference is the premier India focused annual conference organized by the South Asian Business Association, or SABA as we like to be called, at Columbia Business School. Our conference is organized annually, and every year we aim to have influential speakers from different walks of Indian life, whether political, social, or economic, come through and talk about the various undercurrents that permeate Indian life. For example, yesterday we had Mr. Ashwini Tiwari, Managing Director of State Bank of India, talk about the rise of fintech in India. Then we had Mr. Arvind Krishna, Chairman and CEO of IBM, talk about various topics related to India in his keynote speech. After that, we had a fascinating conversation with our panelists about the clean energy transition that India is undergoing, followed by an address by Mr. Piyush Goyal, Honorable Union Minister of Commerce, Industry and Consumer Affairs, Government of India. Before we dive into the agenda for today, I wanted to take a minute and really thank all of our amazing speakers for taking valuable time out of their day to speak to us. I also want to thank our sponsors, SBI, FIA, ITV Gold, Radio Zindagi, the Indian Eye, and Divya Bhaskar for sponsoring our conference and for helping us market our conference to the broader Indian diaspora. Last but not least, I want to thank the audience, the viewers who have taken valuable time out of their day to come and listen to our amazing speakers. Without further ado, here is today's agenda. We'll be kicking off with a one-hour chat with Mr. Swapan Dasgupta and with Dr. Surjit Bhalla, who will discuss policy reforms that will propel India to the next phase of economic growth. Then we will have a one-hour panel with Mr. Harsh Jain, Mr. Rohit Chinnamani, and Mr. Akrit Vaish on building global tech startups. This will be followed by a one-hour chat with Mr. Amitabh Kant, Mr. Manoj Kohli, and Mr. Bharat Kaushal, who are going to discuss the financing environment for new startups in India. We will then have two more panels that discuss the future of work in India in the context of the pandemic and the rise of OTT streaming. And last but not least, we will have a fireside chat with Mrs. Smriti Irani, Honorable Union Minister of Women and Child Development, to conclude our conference. Please stay tuned. Our panel starts exactly at 8 a.m. Eastern Time / 5:30 p.m. Indian Time. Thank you very much.
Hello and welcome everybody to the 17th Annual India Business Conference at the Columbia Business School. On behalf of the South Asian Business Association, I welcome Shri Swapan Dasgupta and Dr. Surjit Bhalla to our discussion today on policy reforms to propel India to the next leg of its growth. We are privileged and honored to have you amidst us, sir, at this conference. We also welcome all attendees here, both virtually and in person at our campus on Manhattan. Shri Swapan Dasgupta is a member of the Indian Parliament and the Rajya Sabha, the upper house. He distinguished himself as a journalist before making his mark as a parliamentarian, a man who wears many hats. I'm privileged to have worked with him over the last few years, and thank you, sir, for taking out the time and being here with us. Dr. Surjit Bhalla is a trained economist who went on to make his mark in the professional as an investment professional. He currently serves as an executive director at the World Bank. Dr. Surjit Bhalla is an eminent columnist who writes on topics ranging from economics and politics, and who better than the both of them to lead our discussion here today. Over the last few years, India has seen a remarkable dynamic government, which has led several policy initiatives from universal financialization to GST to the insolvency and bankruptcy reforms. These reforms have propelled India into the growth that we see today. Going ahead, there are numerous key initiatives which the government is contemplating in terms of providing infrastructure, building toilets for every household, providing clean drinking water. These are some of the reforms that are taking place. And with that, I hand it over to Dr. Bhalla to take the discussion forward. Thank you, sir, once again for being here, and we look forward to the engaging discussion that lies ahead of us.
Thank you, Ashutosh, and welcome, Swapan.
Hello.
Hi. Swapan and I have exchanged views on TV, especially with regard to elections, as well as I've known him for a long time. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be here talking to him. So let me start off. Swapan, you had a viewpoint in the Indian Express just a couple of days ago on what the Rajya Sabha should be doing, since that's the most recent and important hat that you have along your very distinguished career. So what did you have in mind? The article was too short to really go through, but you were hinting at some reforms that are needed in the Rajya Sabha, in the functioning of the parliament as well as the Indian economy.
Yeah, so Surjit, thanks a lot, and lovely to see you virtually. One of the facets of the Indian Parliament, the manner in which the agenda is structured, is that a disproportionate amount of time is given to what is called lawmaking. You pass bills, you make amendments to bills, etc., etc. Now, over the past 2 years or more, I've been noticing that the number of bills, with some notable exceptions, are really bills which are in the nature of tweaking. They're just clarificatory legislation. Supreme Court has passed a particular judgment, and there's a confusion in some parts of the law. Therefore, you make a modest amendment. And this has become the bread and butter of stuff. Now, the entire parliamentary agenda was set up at a time when India was still creating a legal framework, a legislative framework of governance. Now, there has been a suggestion, and many people have said, India is over-legislated and under-governed. You're quite familiar with that. Now, the point is, today we are in a situation where the focus is less on legislation and more on delivery, on performance, on accountability. these are things which are now become the mainstay of governance in India. And these don't get reflected in the parliamentary agenda. And therefore, my suggestion has been that you take the focus away from this excessive amount of lawmaking where you're actually not doing very much, and then move on to actually discussing how good your infrastructure is doing, how bad it is doing, health, specific subjects. And then those reviews are what should make Parliament far more dynamic a place, far more meaningful a place.
I agree with you, Swapan, but do I get a hint from that you have been underworked in Parliament over the last 6 years? Or
yeah, I think that would be a fair assessment to say that people do get underworked, because if that is the main focus, then what can you do?
Yeah.
You make a point of order, you make some, 0-hour mention, you may ask questions, you may ask clarification, but that's more in the nature of information, not debate. And there it is. So I think if you're going to tax your mind in Parliament, I think this is the way to go about it.
Okay. Now, one of the laws that has been hinted at, or change in the laws, and I wanted to get your views on it, has been, and which was hinted at by the PM himself, that time has come for India to have simultaneous elections, both state and federal or union elections. And so what I want to, my own view is, I think it's an idea whose time was there maybe 30 years ago, and even more so today. We seem to be, and lawmakers, politicians, etc., all spending too much time on moving from one election to the next. What would be your recommendation, and when do you think, and I'm happy to discuss that with you, because I strongly believe we should move to that system. So if you do, when do you think we might get there? And if you don't, why not?
See, Surjit, you're quite aware that in the early part of the Republic, in the 50s, there was a de facto simultaneous election.
Yes.
I think it was de facto. Kerala broke the model in the late 50s, and then you had a midterm election, and then one after the other, the states followed soon and set their own timetable to the extent that now we are in a situation where we have annual elections, which is a great distraction from governance, because you have to adjust things to suit your electoral imperatives. And that's what politics is all about. And therefore, a lot of the long-term processes suffer. Now, yes, there are problems which are going to be there. Now, the United States has two sets of elections. You have your presidential election at one point, and then you have your midterm sort of Senate election, Senate and Congress and all that sort of thing. So there are two. So you have a fixed timetable in effect. Now, if you were to do this, you would possibly need a fixed term legislature. You would need a fixed term parliament, you need a fixed term legislature. Are we ready for that? There are complications. There are complications, but
No, what I was going to say, absolutely. And, there's a lot of research done, as you know, around the world on all of this. And there we have the vote of no confidence, which is a particular feature of the parliamentary system which we have. So if a state has a vote of no confidence, and it's an interesting debate in itself, and there can be very legitimate views on both sides. But let us say even we allow for the possibility of a vote of no confidence, that's in the leader. So the party in power, which has now been, for reasons best known, vote of no confidence has been passed in a particular state, that the governor appoint maybe another leader or something to continue. So we need to, what you pointed to is a very important part, but it should, given their costs and benefits to every system. And it seems that, we need to put all you guys together so you can get worked a little bit more on coming out with a system that satisfies all the parties and that in some sense satisfies the principle that you don't want principle of a fixed term schedule. Is there a way, and what would you?
You see, I think the main issue which is really preventing this, two issues. One is that the whole debate has got polarized into who is pro the government, who is pro BJP and who is anti BJP. Now, I think this is an issue which
else in India. So
yeah.
We'll talk about soon.
Yeah. So this is an issue which is far larger than that. This is much, much greater. Now, there is a question of transition. How do you affect the transition? Will you have some governments which are allowed for 7 years just to enable that transition? Will you have governments which will be dissolved in 4 years rather than the 5? Those sort of questions. Now, yes, there has to be one-time decision on where it's all going. Now, I think it may be difficult under the circumstances to have one set of elections every 5 years. It may be better to have it in 2. That's my first suggestion. Because as long as we have the no confidence, as long as we get fractured verdicts, and in sort of a parliamentary first past the post, fractured verdicts are always there. The possibilities are always there, and it happens. How do you deal with those situations? Now, this question of transition and also the timetable is something we need to sort out. But the tragedy is that while this approach has been advocated now for some time, I think Mr. Advani used to advocate that very strongly at one time. Now Mr. Modi has been doing it. You need a certain environment in which people can sit down, have a select committee of parliament which can look into it, give a preliminary. It may take a bit of time. It may take 5 years to get it done. But unless the work starts, unless it's very seriously addressed, we're not going to get anywhere. Alas, it has not been very seriously addressed as of now. It's been thought to be one of those Modi pipe dreams.
On a related issue, and in my work on the constitution, etc., in India, and particularly in India, I think I have one comment somewhere that in India, we have an amendment to the constitution faster than one changes a toothbrush. Now, the relevance we've got something like 129 amendments to the constitution. The US, the oldest democracy, has, I think, 27, 28 amendments. It's a chalk and cheese. Over the kind of changes that we've had. Now, the reference to context is, and I think it was Bajpayee, there was a serious attempt at a new constitutional body to be set up to study the work for a new constitution. Where would you fall on that? And that would be, this is one of the things that look up on elections, because it has to be part of the constitution, and several other, we have changed a lot over the last 75 years. And the question is, what might have been thought to be, and as you know, there were big debates in the Constitutional Assembly at that time as well. Perhaps, a new one, an attempt, and see how that falls.
I have a slightly different view on that. The one of the features about India is there's been a system of relative constitutional continuity. For the past 7 decades, we've had the single constitution, albeit with amendments. And now none of these amendments, apart from perhaps the 42nd Amendment, has fundamentally changed the course. They've been adding details. You've had more states put in, you've got local government being given certain powers, you've had the GST incorporated, etc. These are the things which have been done need-based, without changing the basic edifice of the Constitution. I'm a bit suspicious of the term basic structure of the Constitution, because that has a legalistic meaning and it's got an entire history to it. Now, setting up an entirely new constitution is, to my mind, it's going to open up a very, very fractious debate, which is the last thing, and on a subject which we really don't need to. Our focus is really quite different now. Our focus, as I say, is now for the first time, we're talking about governance, we're talking about delivery, we're talking about how do we improve, how do we create a meaningful, efficient, non-porous welfare system. We actually getting into those sorts of things. We're talking about how best technology can be applied in the process of governance. And this business of having to deal with an entire newly constituent assembly, etc., it's going to be a big distraction. I don't think we can afford this distraction at present. I think it's far better to do tweaking of the system, like changing the parliamentary agenda to a more meaningful thing. It's better to talk about incremental shifts which are necessary, need-based. I don't think the Constitution is a deterrent in any respect. I mean, of course, we could do with junking the term socialism from the preamble to the Constitution, which is a meaningless term. But I think that can be done. But I think that doesn't require a constituent assembly to do it.
I know, but hopefully that'll happen. I mean, the fractious debate that you refer to, and that has happened often, continues to happen. Why is it? I mean, I go from the evidence and the importance of now we have a vastly educated population. So I am more optimistic that we might be ready. There is a generational change, and everybody below the age of now 30 or even 35 or 40 has had some years of education. One interesting thing, when we got our independence in 47, only about the average educational attainment of an Indian citizen was less than 1 year. Today, it is closer to 9. And the US, the average educational attainment is now closer to, has been steady state at around 12 and a half or 13. So the point, what I am trying to state is that maybe we are ready, and maybe, not necessarily for a new constitution. I didn't have that. I think our constitution has served us very, very well. But, we need to, whether there is a need to take a refreshingly new look at some of the baggages that the Constitution has, including the word socialism in the preamble. So that's what let me move to the relevant issue of governance, which I'm very pleased you've pointed out. I've myself, in my studies, there has been a marked improvement in governance. And it comes through, in my opinion, or not my opinion, my research, through what has happened in the pandemic. The pandemic is a fantastic, I believe, natural, what economists call a natural experiment. Everybody was affected by it, and every country was affected by it. and every country responded in their own individual ways. But it turns out, and we're doing the study, I just want to, and I'm sure you are and others, but the way we've handled the delivery of food, in particular services, for the bottom 50-60% of the population, which was never really, we always talked about Garibi Hatao in the name of the poor, was a defining principle of Indian governments for the last 65 years. And what we've seen now is a very refreshing, Poda mentioned about, toilets or whatever, which we never really thought about before. So what I'm trying to get at is that how well do you think it is appreciated both within India and outside of India, the remarkable departure India has made in its delivery, in its promises to the poor, and and mind you, when I say the poor, and I think when the government says the poor, i.e. People like yourself, it is 50, 60, 70% of the population. It's not the 3 or 4%. So is it beginning to be recognized? And is it the fractious nature of our polity that prevents it from being fully appreciated?
Well, I think, ultimately, if I were to take your methodology, there is nothing more compelling than evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look at the voting figures, I think in Uttar Pradesh and Uttarakhand, you'll find that a very significant percentage of the BJP's incremental vote and its stable vote stems not from necessarily Hindu nationalism, although that might be a contributory factor, but from the benefits which they've actually given, which the state has given to the people. And the pandemic was a monumental challenge. It took everyone by surprise. I think maximum you might have it is 3-week warning that these things are no, and everybody till the last believed that it won't sort of come into our shores, but it did. And the response of the state now to feed 800 million people free rations, free basic rations, and using technology to monitor that, to distribute that, to monitor that. And that was repeated in the case of the vaccine program.
Yeah.
The Aadhaar card came in very useful in this respect. Now, in the past...
As in several others, I think Aadhaar has been, the use of it has been one of the greatest achievements.
And I'm very glad. And I'm very glad that in 2014, despite the fact that Aadhaar was introduced by the earlier Congress government, Mr. Modi stuck to it and said, no, this can go on. And in fact, he's expanded the scope of Aadhaar. So the uses to which Aadhaar has been put to is fantastic. Now, there was a larger debate on how all-pervasive is the state in India. And I think you've had your views on it. I've had my views. They're broadly convergent. We thought we've got a bloated state, and we need a more minimal state. Now, in the case of the pandemic, it was the fact that we had a state which was able to deliver, which came in very, very handy. Yeah. So I think certain orthodoxies have also been questioned by the pandemic, the experience of the pandemic. Now we are talking in terms of, okay, how do we make a more targeted state rather than not a state? Yeah. I mean, we sort of modified the old Thatcher version of, let the state wither away sort of thing, be as minimal as possible and stick to defense and foreign policy. To how do we make it, given the context of India, how do we make the state targeted? How do we make it more efficient in terms that they can realize its targets? And that is very important. So in a sense, I'm very glad that Air India has been privatized, because I don't think that was a particular target. That was a particular, that was a meaningful target. I'm glad the defense production has been deregulated, because I think it was necessary. And DRDO will have to compete with the others. And I think you need a gestation period before the private manufacturers and the joint ventures, etc., can come into their own within that structure. You need that. And for that, you probably need to be... but gradually in all these spheres, you are noticing that the state has moved away from certain function and has adopted certain additional responsibilities, but in a very, very focused sort of way. Now, this, ironically, is not very popular to my colleagues in Parliament. In the debate on the budget, I actually heard lament about the fact that the BSNL today is suffering. Now, the point is that at one time, the BSNL and the MTNL had a complete monopoly.
Absolutely.
And that monopoly was also marked by a degree of colossal inefficiency. Now we've got...
I'll come back to economics.
No, I'm just a thing that the competition which we've nurtured has enabled India to give telephonic communication, mobile communication, database communication to everybody. Yeah. I mean, it's revolutionized the field. And today that we can talk about people filling in their forms, having all this online with their smartphones, is a complete consequence. It wouldn't have happened if BSNL had been there.
Yeah. Okay, talking about orthodoxies, then I'll come back to the very important area of economic policy and economic performance. You mentioned the recent, obviously important election in UP, and I remember with having this discussion when we were both co-panelists back in 2019 about the role of caste in determining voting behavior. And if you recall, I have consistently had the view or the interpretation of the evidence was that caste did not determine voting behavior. And I noticed that Mr. Adityanath, Chief Minister, also had the same comment post the election and perhaps even prior. So you think there is now a general, at the margin, and when you've done enough election analysis, I don't have to, and I've done, so it's not that caste doesn't determine how a person votes in broad terms, but the marginal voter, the fence sitter, is not affected by caste, at least is my view. So there are 40% of the people or 30% who will always vote one way, 30% will always vote the other. But then there's a vast middle that determines elections. And that, for some reason, I don't see much, even though evidence upon evidence mounts up, that the 40% of the populace does not vote according to caste. You think now, particularly after the UP election, this has become orthodoxy, the new orthodoxy, or the new conventional?
No, I don't think it's become. I think there is a role of caste, but it's not the way this mechanical application of caste equals to certain votes, etc. Caste representation is still very important.
Yeah,
I think
it's the marginal voter. I'm talking about the marginal voter. Yeah.
To ensure equitable caste representation in terms of giving your seats, in terms of all that, is still very, very important. Because people do still sometimes think of our people, our community, how is it being represented, etc. And that sort of adds to the solid. But you're completely right that everything else being equal, the tendency of people to vote for considerations apart from caste, and there could be various other considerations. Governance is one factor. You could be just angry about certain things. other more immediate factors could be a factor. So these considerations are coming into play in a more, I think, in a very focused way. And I think that if you look at it in terms of a macro vision, caste has certainly diminished its importance.
Now, on this,
in a micro sense, you might still find other evidence to that. And in a national way, when you have national elections, of course, you cannot appeal to people on the basis of caste.
We discussed the Constitution, etc. One of the aspects of the Constitution, and this will be my last question on the political side, and then I want to turn to economics. But this is much more your expertise. Caste and elections, always fascinating. So let us say we had to rewrite the books now in terms of representation, and let's take it as representation. Everybody has a caste and everybody has a sex. So why not have the following requirement? No reserved seats according to caste. Okay, so one, we eliminate that, but we have the requirement that every party nominate 50% women and 50% men, and the caste is also chosen according to 50 the OBC, the three castes that we have, scheduled caste, or distinctions that we have, scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and OBCs. That we have the broad numbers. Then let the people decide. This thing of having, it may have been very necessary, though Ambedkar was very much against this back in 1945 or the mid-40s or post-47, sorry. But, that's what I meant when I said that maybe time has come now for at least these larger changes, which are significant improvements and satisfied. So women's vote, should we have reservation for seats for women? That doesn't seem to make too much sense to me. So here's a formula by which you can broaden and make the scope more equitable and let the people decide.
A small snag in that would probably be, how do you ensure that the adequate number of people get elected from those things?
That's Swapan. That's the important point. Why should we care? And it'll turn out.
No. Firstly, I think people talk about politics being the art of the possible. Today, if you even broach the subject, the Surjit Bhalla plan, I think you'll see a complete outrage. And I'm sure anyway, a lot of people who listening to this online seminar and who've heard your views will be absolutely outraged. How can we have a man who talks like this in the IMF as India's representative?
Okay. The IMF. Okay. Let me now move to economics. I don't think it's as outrageous. I think it's very fair. I think it'll be well, but this is part of the debate that we should have. The same
certainly.
Debate.
Certainly, I think the debate.
Simultaneous elections. I think this is a significant improvement that can come about, and it'll obviously be done after there is no diktat on this. Let the people decide, and the people will decide this, and then move on to whatever they decide. Now coming to if one looks at the Indian economy now, and we were talking about delivery, etc., and across the world. So as part of my job at the IMF, I have to look at least evaluate or look at all the economies. If I look at what's happening in India, and in particular export growth, in particular tax revenue, in particular fiscal deficit, which comes out from expenditure control and targeted expenditure, have you been surprised at the remarkable performance of the economy post-COVID?
Well, I mean, I think the economy sort of bounced back quite remarkably. There was a disruption as far as COVID was concerned. We are still suffering from supply chain disruptions post the Ukraine war. So, despite all this, I think firstly, there's a lot of pent-up demand. Secondly, I think the improvements in infrastructure are certainly trying to pay returns. So, I think we still haven't seen what the Indian economy is capable of performing. I mean, I think that is still untested. We're just still performing at 60% speed, 65% speed.
Yeah.
That's my personal view of it. And, get to a situation where these crises are not there. And then we'll test it. And then we'll also know exactly where renewed focus is to be put in. Today, for example, I think it was Deepak Parekh who made this case that we need to have invested far more in oil and natural gas than has been the case if we're going to get that. Now, that's an important contribution to a debate. Now we can think about this in this sort of respect. And but I think the remarkable story, at least in the past 7 years, has been the exponential growth, improvement, upgradation of Indian infrastructure. I mean, at every department, whether you see shipping, whether you see airlines, road, it's just moved into another thing. And I think this needs to be appreciated. But I think also it's still work in progress.
No, absolutely.
I think you can probably supplement these by sort of statistics and things like that. I mean, the road building program in India.
Yeah.
We're building something like, 300 or 400 kilometers per day. And the quality of the roads
is also
quite admirable. But there are patches in India where it's not happened. Yeah. My own state of West Bengal, where I am at present, is certainly a laggard in various respects in all this. Land acquisition for infrastructure projects. Now that suffered a bit of a setback during that land acquisition bill.
And the farm laws.
The farm laws, which is beneficial to certain big farmers, but is not very beneficial for the other marginal farmers who are there in many states.
Look, this is, you've been a very prominent, successful journalist, as well as thinker, as well as intellectual on the Indian scene now for for decades, actually. And I have tried to dabble in journalism a little bit. But, if one looks at the media coverage, both in India and outside, as a general comment, I think the media has either not, certainly is not appreciated the profound changes taking place in the Indian economy. Now, these are your colleagues. And I'm not talking about now your colleagues in Parliament, where they are, there are constraints as to how much you can agree with the opposition or the government in power. But the media, you think there is room for a more balanced view in the media as to what is going on in India?
Well, when you're talking about the media, you're talking about primarily the English language media, and
yes,
I think
that's the one I'm most familiar with.
I think, that's the one you're most familiar with, and I think certainly the international media,
yes,
not least in the city where I think the Columbia University is located, is one of those who, if I were to use Mahatma Gandhi's term about Catherine Mayer's Mother India, it's a sort of gutter inspector's report, and on a daily basis. Now, if you think that the principal question in India is the question of identity. You're going to come up with one sort of reportage. Just like in the 70s, I used to often joke that the principal preoccupation of certain British papers was to look at the last toy train which is operating, or the last Englishman who's sitting in Darjeeling. So I think it's what your main concern is. Now here, if you think that India is a country which is in the throes of a civil war, you're going to do, if that is your basic assumption on which you start, if that's your editorial
But why are they able to get away with it?
They get away because, we believe in the freedom of the press. So, you can write any stuff you feel like and get away. And there is a sort of a left liberal, increasingly woke consensus, which is now emerging in various parts of the Western world, which is overrepresented in the media. I think this is not the case so much in the Indian media.
Mm-hmm.
I think despite all its faults and despite all the creases there are in the newspapers, it's by and large, it does give a reasonably representative. I mean, if you look, if you compare 2 or 3 papers, you will be able to get more or less the whole story. They may get their elections wrong because they have this natural proclivity that the party which will win is the party which I want to win.
Yeah,
which is different from
No, that's a very important. I want to pursue that a little bit, and that's a very, very important point. As election analysts, as forecasters, as well as trying to understand, on forecasting. A professor of mine who did the first election model or economic determinants of elections, Wayfair, for the United States, which was done, I think, in 1971. He had a quip that, as a forecaster, one should forecast often and always remind people when you're right. Now, the point of that that quote, as it were, is that I've learned as a forecaster that you pay a huge price for forecasting in public. In private, you can say what you will, but in public, for forecasting something that you believe in should be the case rather than that is the case. And this is, I've not understood how it's in anybody's self-interest to forecast something that they analytically, for whatever that means, know is not likely, not correct, or not likely to be true. So why is that? Why is that persisting? So in other words, why isn't there a more balanced assessment of reality in the media, ex ante as well as ex post?
Surjit, let me once, before I develop the subject, let me remind you of the embarrassing situation you faced when you predicted a monumental sweep for Hillary Clinton, and I won a bet.
Yes, I know that. Listen, and I won elections. There are 2 elections I got wrong. One, that one, and the other one was in 1991, when I said that Rajiv Gandhi will come back with a comfortable majority. And I've got reasons why I got both of them wrong. But yes, that's my point. It still hasn't prevented.
Fair enough. I think we all agree that the forecasters, the pollsters cannot get it right all the time. I think but by and large, is their methodology robust? Are they doing fair amount of random sampling? Are their choice of the respondents socially representative, etc.? Now, these are questions which I think...
But those are well settled, Swapan.
Well settled
the excuses that they give.
By and large, but by and large, if you look at the recent round of elections in Uttar Pradesh, you'll find that more
Everybody
or less
got it right.
everybody got it right. Sometimes when it's a sort of emphatic mandate, I think it's very rare to get it wrong. But sometimes it's a problem. Now, I know that in the case of West Bengal, a lot of people got it wrong for the simple reason that they I think, oversampled the Hindu population, they undersampled the Muslim population, and they didn't account for the fact that the Muslim turnout was
Much higher.
much higher. So they caused that imbalance. We can look upon it in hindsight and say, this is where you erred. But I would still be hesitant to say that the pollsters are, I mean, there used to be pollsters which would be bought. I mean, I'll be honest.
I think there still are.
But I think there are probably some which can be bought. But by and large, if they have a sense of their own reputation, and because they're not in it just for one election, and elections being an annual event in India, so you if you put in your bid for the next one, we should have a degree of credibility in having forecast the right.
Yeah. Moving to when we were young, the U.S.
When we were young,
when we were young, the U.S. was considered very appropriately and very correctly, and the West in general, but the U.S. in particular, as the land of opportunity. Now, there is and I certainly feel that there has been, and we talked about the brain drain and all the rest of it, how we were losing out. But now if I look at India and I look at other countries, in particular the US, etc., and this has relevance for the students who've organized this talk, that, I think there are more opportunities, genuine opportunities in India today than perhaps any place else on the planet. What this has to do with, I think there's a genuine structural change which has happened, is continuing to happen. There's several contributory factors, education being one of them. One statistic I like to cite is that there are more women in college today than men. And I think the opportunities, etc. So just, I'm sure the students at Columbia, etc., thinking, should they stay on? Should they go back? My advice is, listen, it's the most exciting place on earth, and it's the place with the greatest amount of opportunity. So your take.
It's ironic you say that, because if you were to listen to debates in Parliament, and especially from the opposition, they would say it's never been gloomier in India than ever before. You'd get the impression that India is suffering from the worst economic crisis at the level of Sri Lanka, probably, which is actually doing pretty awful. It's pretty awful in Sri Lanka. So you sometimes get, now the question is, are these opportunities being tracked in the right way by the so-called political class? The political class is still thinking in terms of public sector jobs, government jobs. They're thinking in terms of how many fixed employment there is, etc. And the other opportunities which come in, which are there, in terms of people who do part-time business, people who combine a job with other things, their rozgar rather than their nokri, if I may use that thing. That means that how they earn their livelihood as opposed to where they are employed might be a better way of looking at it. And I think that's not being done in any way. Now, more and more opportunities are coming in India's way. I think many more need to come in the agricultural sector. Many, many more.
I think value, that.
Yeah. No. Value addition is still not.
Actually, those are the next 10 minutes or so I want to devote to what reforms you would recommend economic reforms and in particular agriculture. Look, the one sector in India that has not been reformed, and matter of fact, there have been several anti-reform agricultural measures taken place since the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000. So I really, and there aren't too many examples of countries where agriculture has not only not been reformed, but where agriculture was not the very first sector to be reformed. So, and we've just been through the experience of the agricultural reforms being tabled. They were way past due their time to be brought in. So and I completely agree with you that, and that is why I think the government and Prime Minister Modi really was quite persistent, and correctly so, to bring about these reforms. And then we had, and this is what ties in with the conversation we've been having, whether it's the media, etc. I was stunned as to what happened in the public, in the media about these agricultural reforms. And, there were, even the Punjab government came out with an outline, a blueprint for reforms, agricultural reforms, which were identical to what had been proposed and passed in Parliament. Now, when do you think, first of all, and I don't think it's if, when do you think the agricultural reforms stated in 2020 would be back on the table? And what are some of the other reforms that you think India needs right now to further accelerate its acceleration? We've done a lot of reforms over the last 7 years, really quite tremendous. The structure of the Indian economy has changed, but the task is, I think, 3/4 done, actually. But what is the remaining quarter that you would recommend that we pursue?
You see, Surjit, the ironic thing is that many of these reforms are actually being implemented in practice, but through the back door. Take contract farming. Contract farming, there were certain guidelines, there was a certain institutionalization of it, which was there in the farm laws. Mm-hmm. This is happening, but in a very unorganized, ad hoc basis, which is going on. So the
official stealth rather than unofficial.
It's a combination of unofficial. Now the Food Corporation, the minimum procurement price. Now that is something which exists in Punjab, which exists in Western UP, which exists in certain other parts of these big wheat producing areas. On the rice producing areas, the Food Corporation doesn't exist really in any meaningful way. It's the small Vaparis who buy it, procure it, etc. Now, if you're getting corporate houses to come and step in and do an organized thing, it's happening. But it's happening minus a legislative framework. So I think the whole point about this is, I believe that this farmers' agitation was set up with a political purpose. And
one of the leading architects admitted that it was purely for the
UP and Punjab, and it's elections driven. The whole thing was, and therefore immediately after the election results are out, that the farmer protests have disappeared, etc., and it left no visible impact on the poll results. That's the other important thing to notice, that it had no impact.
Where in the world is Takayat now?
He's there. He's there, but you see, again, here they organized the protests rather imaginatively, and they got a lot of media publicity for it, and the publicized thing of sitting on protest for about nearly a year certainly paid returns. But whether the repeal of the laws was because of the protests of the farmers or because of certain other national security concerns in Punjab is an open question. I think we shouldn't be unmindful of that.
That's why it's interesting that the Punjab government itself in June of 2020 proposed very much the same kind of reform. So I think the security concerns are very.
I think we will get these reforms. We'll also get them on a statewide level, and we will see them being implemented informally without a legislative framework.
So best of all possible worlds. Okay, running out of time. I want to ask Mr. Podar if there are some questions. I don't know how the structure of this is for this very, we've got him captive. So if you would like to ask some questions, etc., I'll hand it over back to you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your insightful, engaging and rather candid remarks on these subjects. I think we have the next panel starting at 9 o'clock. You spoke of matters ranging from domestic issues, infrastructure and capacity building, the economics and politics of policy reform, and most importantly, advice for us as budding entrepreneurs and opportunities in India. We thank you once again for this discussion. As Swapan as always has often remarked in private that economy is a matter too important to be left to economists alone. And with Dr. Bhalla, a renowned economist, sharing his bird's eye perspective from the IMF, I don't think we could have asked for a better panel to discuss the subject. Once again, thank you very much for taking the time and being here with us today. Hopefully next year, this conference will be in person and we could have you here with us at the campus in Manhattan. With that, I thank the attendees for being here with us and invite them to join on to our next session on the tech panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Swapan. Great meeting.
Thank you.
Even
Bye.
if it's virtual. Yeah. See you soon. Yeah.
See you soon.